cuneus, or usually we talk about the posterior cingulate at the back, and then these kind of wings on the side, and then some stuff up in the front. But the back is where kind of a lot of the meat is. The inferior parietal lobule is really interesting because it has something to do with separation of self and other, sort of a boundary, how you see yourself. And so you will see big changes, especially on the right side, when people are in more of a mystical state, where there is a lack of differentiation, and you're connected to something else. I actually see big changes in this, some of the work I've done with psychics and mediums. When they're tapped in, this is the area where you see a bunch of stuff going on. It's like they are not, it's not just me. They're sort of tapping into something bigger. So that's interesting. For me, it's interesting. The cuneus back here, we already talked about, that's kind of often thought of as the hub of the default mode network, along with the posterior cingulate. And so again, you see a big decrease there in alpha. Shouldn't be a big shock. We should be pretty comfortable with that by now. And this one I thought was really interesting. So I looked at gamma and just picked a couple of brain regions to look at and see, well, what's going on there? And I highlighted the insula. So you can see the insula is a little bit deeper in. It's in the temporal lobes on the sides, but it's deeper in. And the insula is very much involved with emotion and basic emotional responses. So all kinds of things, anger, sadness, disgust, joy, all of those things. It's also involved in empathy, the insula. And it's interesting because, again, you see that the right side is much more activated than the left. And my experience has been that when the right side of the insula is more activated, that's more of a body, it's like a felt emotion. Like you feel it, you have like heartbreak, right? And you like feel it in your body. Whereas the left side is a little bit more intellectual. It's like thinking about a feeling, right? So again, you can see that like he was in it. I mean, it was obvious, but we can see it right there. So that's pretty cool. So the next thing I did, just real quick, was I also looked at the data afterwards, after he rested for, it was probably 20 minutes. So after we finished the session, and then I did a post data collection. And so I just kind of lined them up here so that you can see the difference between what was happening during and then what was happening afterwards. And so, Delta looks similar. Theta looks pretty similar, so it hadn't changed a whole lot at this point. Alpha's starting to come back. His alpha's starting to come back, which again is pretty consistent. We see that pretty consistently in the research. Sometimes people will get actually a really nice alpha rebound after the experience. Beta looks about the same. Oh, you see some high beta starting to kick in here. So there is some research with other medicines that show an increase of high beta. And so it's interesting that it's kind of shifting a little bit. And then look at his gamma. Boy, that gamma just dropped. It just dropped out. So, what would be curious would be to see, it'd be really interesting to follow this over time, like later that day, the next day, 36 hours later. So, some other kind of case study things I've done are kind of like that, where map somebody beforehand with a medicine, and then immediately after, and then 36 hours, and then 5 days, and then 10 days after. And so watching the trajectory of how the brain is shifting and moving and integrating. So we keep using that word integration. It's like, well, what does that look like in the brain? So I think there's some exciting ways that we can advance kind of some of the work that we're doing in this area to really start to understand the process a bit more. So some of the takeaways with this, that I kind of mentioned that it was consistent with other research, and especially Juan's over here. So in Juan's study, he found the average increase of gamma was 138%. So again, pretty consistent with what we were seeing here. There was also, again, in Juan's research, decreased slow wave activity. And I picked out alpha because that's the one that drops the most. And the average drop was 88%. So in this case, we noted that it was very right hemisphere dominant, kind of the pattern we were seeing, which is interesting. Don't know what that means necessarily, but it's interesting. And then a lot of this kind of starts to resolve after about 20 minutes. Things start to kind of come back online, look a little bit more like they did at baseline. we talked about, we've talked a little bit about gamma, and I was mentioning it in the video. So gamma is kind of this interesting brainwave, and by the way, just having a bunch of gamma by itself is not awesome. That's not necessarily a good thing. You know, you don't want to just be cranking up gamma without it being attached to a state of consciousness. So, but what I'm talking about here is gamma being attached to certain states of consciousness. One of the things that gamma seems responsible for is this idea, this thing that we call the binding problem. It's kind of how the brain takes a lot of information and puts it together. How do I understand the world? How do I understand the universe? Some of the things with gamma that I think are particularly interesting, I mentioned a couple of them in the video. So one is that you see increases of gamma in expert musicians when they're listening to music. You know, as much as I love music, I'm not a musician. And so if you looked at my brain, there would be no gamma when I listen to music, even though I love music, because I don't get it. I don't understand music like an expert musician does. Same thing with meditators, expert meditators. You'll see big bursts of gamma. There's more research pointing toward this. You don't see this in novice meditators, by the way, because novice meditators don't understand how to fully engage in that state. There's research with lucid dreaming showing gamma, ayahuasca, and then now this one I've got a little asterisk here. I just found this one, even though it's from 2013. I just found this study. I'm still trying to digest it. It was with rats. That's why there's an asterisk there. It's easier to study things like the dying brain in a rat. Anyway, there's these bursts of gamma that happen throughout the process of when the brain starts dying, which I think is fascinating, that we start looking at these combinations of things, expertise, lucid dreaming, you know, psychedelic states, and in death. It's like, interesting. So I think there's a lot more for us to sort of learn with gamma, and I'm really excited for kind of where to go with some of this. Well, I just mentioned some of these ideas, but you know, I think it's going to be important to look at things like right versus left activation and how that connects to the particular experience, or does it? Is it important? Using standardized questionnaires so that we can really start to understand what's going on for somebody. I mean, obviously we want to do interviews and things like that, but you know, having some way to sort of quantify the data. This is what Juan was mentioning, the same person across time, within and between sessions, I think would be really cool. It would also be really interesting to look at what is the impact on an individual of different medicines. How does somebody respond to 5-MeO versus, you know, whatever, ayahuasca or whatever it is that they're using. And to see, is there a similar process for that individual, or does, you know, as I think probably most people in this room sort of recognize that different medicines have a little bit of a different energy. And so it would be interesting to see how that sort of plays out. And then the other point is that we've just been looking at power, how much power is being generated in different frequencies. But another important metric to look at in the brain is something called coherence, which has to do with how things are connected and how regions of the brain are talking to each other. And so, for example, again, going back to Juan's study, he found hypercoherence when people were in their experience. So it means things are hyperconnected in the delta and the gamma bands. And so, you know, looking more into that, like what's going on with this hypercoherence and what can we learn about that? So that's what I've got as far as kind of preliminary analysis of looking at this. Like I said, I want to break it down some more and analyze that some more. And once I do that, we'll make it available. I'll give it to Martin and he can figure out how to distribute it somehow. Here's how you can get a hold of me if you need to get a hold of me for any reason. Email's best, actually. Love to kind of connect with folks if they have some interest or want to, you know, kind of work in this area. By the way, I'm currently located in Corvallis, but I'm moving to Eugene very soon. So for all you Eugene folks, yeah. That's it. Oh, yeah.
Did you find any difference in between having male and female subjects? Just because I know that females tend to produce different chemicals in the brain compared to males most typically.
Juan?
No, in my study there were about 40% females and males, and 20 males.
Did it look the same or different?
Well, no, there's a pattern that's the same, it's consistent, you know. I mean, if the women come in and maybe they're having a moon or something, it could change. Yeah. The variables. I screen
You want me
people,
to?
just, to have a good baseline.
Good to be consistent, yeah.
Sure.
I think one area that would be really interesting, I mean, I think, those kinds of differences are interesting and potentially important, but also, people tend to have a different baseline resting EEG pattern. Some people don't have much alpha to begin with. So what happens if you're working with somebody like that versus somebody that's got a ton of alpha? So looking at somebody's base resting EEG and what happens with that, is there a way, again, we're like baby steps into this, so it's like, there's so much to do, but it's a great question. Somebody, yeah.
Yeah, this is really beautiful. I haven't seen so much detailed interpretation of what's going on in the areas of brain like humans. And I worked with Walter Freeman in Berkeley, who was the discoverer and the first guy to research in someone's gamma. It wasn't even on the machines back then.
Right.
And he found it in the olfactory bulb of rabbits.
Oh, yeah.
And when the rabbit would breathe in at the height of his breath, if he was hungry and curious, it would pop into gamma. And the gamma would synchronize within, and it had different intensity levels within, this is one cortical area, not a whole brain. And so those were patterns that matched different states that the animal was in.